Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class. We are starting up a new series this week. If you've been with us in the past, we have been going through Acts chapter 2 and looking at what it means to be a part of the church. Acts chapter 2 is that very first chapter where the church is established on the day of Pentecost. People are added to the church, and we get that wonderful description that we've been talking about for 8 or 9 weeks on what it means to be a part of the church and all of the different actions that the church had there. Starting this week, and for a couple weeks after, we're going to continue with the idea of how the church operates, but specifically, we're going to talk about a term that we'll call the remnant. The idea of the remnant pops up several times throughout Scripture. And always it's about this idea that God has always reserved for himself a group of people. And often when we think about the remnant, we think about a small group of people that God has kept. Now, obviously, everyone is capable of being God's chosen people. God chooses everyone. God desires that all men and women would be saved. But what we know from reality is that number is often not as large as we might think that it is. Even not everyone who calls on the name, who calls out Lord, Lord, shall be saved. So we have this idea that the remnant, those who are actually staying true to God, is smaller than what we might imagine it to be. So we're going to hit on several scriptures and talk about developing this idea. And of course, we're going to have more time to talk about it in future weeks. So, Jeremy, how have I butchered this thought? Where can we go with this?
Well, I don't think you butchered it at all. I think that was excellent. That's exactly the idea here. Is it implies the idea of a remaining few, a commitment to principle over popularity. And when you think of now, one word of caution when we think about this thing is when we're talking about the remnant, and this is something that we're going to see pop up over and over again throughout the Old Testament, is there are going to be some people that we thought were on our side who aren't when you have a shift in culture or a shift in religion or something like that, and come to find out that people you thought, oh yeah, we're on the same team, well, they weren't for whatever reason. There's myriads of reasons for that, and we'll probably come back to some of those later. But it's this idea of a commitment to principle over popularity, a commitment to foundational teachings. And that's kind of goes back to some things we talked about when we talked about Acts chapter 2, is there were things that they believed. There was a foundation that they had, okay? And they weren't willing to just uproot the whole thing and move off of the foundation when the foundation became unpopular, or when the culture became less amenable to the foundation or anything like that. Now, we're not necessarily talking about fundamentalism. We're not necessarily talking about an irrational stubbornness, okay? And so often that word fundamentalist gets thrown around a lot. Today, it's usually pejorative. When you look at it, really, there's a lot of cultural baggage that comes with fundamentalism. Just read any contemporary American history book that talks about the 1920s. You'll see that. But at its most basic level, fundamentalism is a commitment to fundamentals. And so it's an idea of anchoring onto lasting ideals regardless of what's going on in the world around us. Obviously,
really quick before we move on the idea of fundamentalism, is that somehow tied to sectarianism?
Can be.
Okay, so it's not being tied to a group, right? So it's not being focused on what we mean by the remnant is not someone who is about the church as a country club, as a social gathering, but rather, as you said, as tied to principles which only have foundation in God. I suppose we could have man-made principles, but they wouldn't be lasting in any sense.
Right, yeah. And that really gets to the core of something we've talked about before, undenominational or pre-denominational Christianity. We're not committed to an earthly organization as an earthly organization. We've talked before that we use the name Churches of Christ as and that's a biblical name, obviously. But if you found a church somewhere that had never heard of Churches of Christ, but they were worshiping according to the New Testament, they were teaching New Testament doctrine, they were preaching the New Testament, worshiping according to the New Testament, they would be part of the church that belongs to Christ, even if they don't have that name on the front door. And so it can't, fundamentalism can become tied to sectarianism when it is about earthly organizations or man-made organizations, or I'm committed to this institution, rather than the ideals that the institution was built to proclaim. I think of a quote from the Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery, which was authored by Barton W. Stone and 6 other former members, actually, at the time, of the Presbyterian Church. When they left the Presbyterian Church to begin a restoration movement on the American frontier. And they said in the Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery, we will that this body die and dissolve into the body of Christ. It wasn't about that group. It was about the principles. And that is what makes the remnant idea so important, is this is a group of people that it doesn't matter what the culture is saying, what's going on around them. These are the principles. And if all about me leave these principles, that doesn't matter, because it's the principles that are the animating idea. It's, as we've discussed, Jesus is the animating idea of the church. And the things that he teaches, those are important because he teaches them. And that's what we're grounded on.
Right. Yeah, we have our prime focus there. So you've hit on a few of these. I think some of the scriptures that we will consider will also get at this idea. I'm wondering, what are the big ideas? What are the big shifts in society that tend to pull people away from being ideal focused, from being I can't help but use the term from being Christians to Christians in name only? Mm-hmm. What is it that draws people along that spectrum? But before you go into this, I think one of the things we need to be careful about, and us too, and anyone who's identifying as part of the remnant, is that even when someone goes away from the church and goes more towards a cultural church, or goes more towards the pools of culture, we need to remember that perhaps they were a brother or sister, that they have a history with us, that as Revelation puts it, they had a first love, and it is part of our responsibility to try to bring those people back to us. So what are some of the things that take people away?
Well, as large ideas or large things that take us away, I think fear is one that can pull us away. A fear that comes from a lack of confidence. Sure. You know, one of the things that gets me is people who, and I understand the concerns, because for so long our culture was so very amenable to the basics of Christian thought. It's not anymore. Spoiler alert, we'll come back to that. But people who are like, oh, well, I'm just not sure if we can really take the gospel out into this much more diverse marketplace of ideas, when in reality the world more and more today resembles the first century world that they took those ideals out into. If they can do it, we have the same message. We can do it too. We worship the same God. We can do it too. So I think some of it is a lack of confidence. Some of it probably stems from a fear of rejection, a fear of seeming on the outside. There's a phenomenon I sometimes will refer to as proving your bona fides. You know, you say you want to be liked by a certain in group of people. So you say, well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm not like those Christians. And so you go criticize them to prove you're not like them. And if we're not careful, we can get caught up in this idea of wanting to be liked in the world. To be frank, materialism is something that can draw us away. Look, Jesus didn't say this is going to be easy. In fact, he said it's going to be hard. Jesus doesn't say if persecution comes, he says when persecution comes. So, I mean, and so fear, just that can undermine commitment, materialism, a lack of confidence, can all undermine that commitment. And we need to make sure that, again, we are coming back to this idea of these are the principles, these are the ideals that I'm coming down
on. Real quickly on the idea of materialism, I believe this is true. I've heard people say that Jesus speaks more about money than he does about any other topic. The examples that he uses, that seems to be a key part of what Jesus is trying to convert people from. And so I'll include myself here. I think that that we probably struggle more with materialism than we give ourselves credit for. And if you think that you don't struggle with it, I hope you don't. But it's worth considering that Jesus seems to think that it's more of a hidden sin that isn't as obvious. Just because you don't have to be rich to be materialistic, to be more focused with the things of this world. One other thing that I think draws us away that I think is worth talking about, and Jeremy, this is going to 1 Kings, is it chapter 19? Chapter 19, yeah. Yep. So here, God is speaking to Elijah. Mm-hmm. Elijah has fled from Jezebel earlier in the chapter, and Elijah thinks that he's alone. And God promises that he has, to use the word, that he has kept a remnant. What's our number here? I'm trying to find it. Is it 7,000?
7,000. 7,000 not bowed the knee to Baal. 7,000 who have not kissed him.
Right. So Elijah thinks that he's alone, but God tells him, you are not alone. There is a group, a small group, but there is a group that have not given over to this power. And it's the political power that I think is one of the what's the word I'm looking for? Something that draws God's people away, right? Mm-hmm. So if we look throughout the Old Testament, I think for any of us who have spent any time reading through the Old Testament, one of the things that we see is however goes the leader, goes God's people. You know, when there is a leader that follows after God's heart, Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, Josiah, Hezekiah, we can think of these leaders who are known for their amazing faith. And every impression that we get is that because the leader follows God, God's people follow God, that the Israelites are able to stick around. And Elijah is kind of surprised because Ahab and Jezebel are such evil, awful people, bad leaders. And he reasonably thinks that I must be the only one. You know, that because we have bad leaders in charge, there's not going to be very many of us who really are following after God the way that he wants us to. And God puts down that notion, but once again, 7,000 is not that many. I'll ask the question, obviously any commentary you have too, but why is it that bad leaders tend to draw down the number of people who are willing to remain faithful?
Well, I mean, there's any number of reasons that it could be. In some cases, access to power. You have to, if you want to influence the leader, you have to be in a position to influence the leader. And if you're going to criticize the leader, they're probably not going to listen to you, especially if you're going to call them out for some sinful action, as John the Baptist found out when he criticized Herod for marrying his brother's wife.
I shouldn't laugh about beheadings, but yes, that's
well,
and
you think about it. I mean, it was he. I don't think he didn't know what he was getting himself into. I think he probably knew that he was Herod. I mean, most people knew how the Herodians acted, but he did it anyway. And Herod wasn't in. I mean, he wasn't in a. He didn't have a desire to really have John out there criticizing him, so he locked him up. And then Herodias came along, and boy, she really didn't want to be criticized, as John found out. So some of it has to do with access to power. Some of it, again, is sometimes it's just easier to get along by going along. It's interesting. You mentioned there are 7,000 people who remain faithful. One of the things you see in the period of the, and this has always fascinated me, in the period of the divided kingdom, is how quickly the people will lurch from idolatry to following God, to idolatry to following God, almost like it's like whatever the king says, that's what they go do. Some of that probably had to do with just the nature of religion in the ancient world. Different regions practice this in different ways, but religion did have something of a civic element to it. So you worshiped a god because that was the god of your people. And if the king said, we're going to worship this god, okay, we're going to go worship that god. So what does that show us about what's going on here? That shows us that a lot of these people that worshiped God during the good kings, some of them may or may not have been all that committed to Jehovah or Yahweh so much as, well, the king says worship Yahweh, so I'm going to go worship Yahweh, and off they go worshiping Yahweh. And then, the next king comes along, and he's going to go worship Baal or Molech or one of those guys. I'm going to go follow him. I mean, Manasseh rules, I think, not long after Hezekiah, if I'm getting my timeline right. And Manasseh sacrifices his sons to a false god. And the people just follow along right after him. Josiah expands the Passover to what was left of the northern kingdom after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. And then Josiah is killed in battle, and the next king comes along, he goes off and worships idols, and the people just right after him. So there's a commitment issue there with some of those people, I think, that, okay, the king says do this. The people in power say do this, so I'm going to go do this. The people in power say go do that, so I'm going to go do that. So now these 7,000, the 7,000 that are mentioned here in 1 Kings 19, and what I find fascinating is this is right after Mount Carmel, right? So you have this massive religious revival, and could God have been any more clear about who was God and who wasn't on Mount Carmel?
Well, and you're right. The people who are there in the audience, though, kind of fall into your category of these people are just wanting to see which God's the most powerful, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so they've got this great religious revival, and it doesn't make a lick of difference in the long run. Think about it. You have these people that they saw this event, and it doesn't make a difference. Okay. So, that one of the things that shows us is, look, there is 7,000, but here's the thing about the 7,000. They were willing to follow God before God sent fire from heaven.
Right.
See, the people were like, slaughter the priests of Baal, and we're on the side of the Lord. And then Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you. And Elijah leaves. And the next thing we know, the people haven't changed at all, really, except for these 7,000. Because these 7,000, they were there not just in the big revival events. It's interesting. In 1 Kings 19 is where Elijah runs to Mount Sinai, and there's a great wind and an earthquake, and the Bible very pointedly says that God was not in those things. And then there's a quiet whisper, and then Elijah goes out and stands before the Lord. Mm-hmm. See, So this remnant, it's not the size of the remnant that matters here. It's the faithfulness to God that you see in all of this.
So you have me thinking about several things. I guess one of those is there's an intergenerational portion of this that even for the greatest leaders, passing on your faith is not easy. And we could start naming off people, and I don't think it's productive to do that, but people who we really respect in the faith, and it seems as if their children are not the icons of faith, the pinnacles of faith that they are. I have that within my own family. And so you wonder, why is it so difficult to maintain that over time? And then also this idea of how do we convert someone from being power obsessed? So these people who are watching the sacrifices and want to see this powerful God, I would equate them with those at the Areopagus who just wanted to hear a really good speech. Who can win this debate? And it's the same, I think, in today's church for those who want to be a part of a congregation that has a lot of good social ties. We've talked about social capital a lot. I want to be a part of a congregation where there's city officials that go there, or powerful business people, or just a really great program for my kids. As if programs and connections are what save us. Or I wouldn't say anyone would go that far, but that's what brings value to a group of people. So how do we become the remnant, and how do we get away from this idea of being connected to the people rather than the principles that underlies the church? Also, just for time's sake, we probably want to go over to Romans 9 too, but I'm not sure where we want to spend our time.
Well, so it's a good question. I mean, anybody who has raised kids knows they're really great when they're small and they just do what they're told.
However, speak for yourself. Yeah.
However, very, very quickly they develop a mind of their own, and it's usually all of the characteristics about yourself that it's like, I had no idea how annoying that was. By the way, that was not aimed at my kids; it was aimed at me. But people do have minds of their own.
Right.
I mean, and that's the hard thing. And now what can we do? We can emphasize that it's the principles. We can talk about the principles. We can shape our programs. And let's not make the mistake of saying that programs are somehow bad or somehow wrong. No. So much as to say, look, the programs have a purpose. The benevolence programs we do because we are called to see others as the image of God and to help them. We worship because we are worshiping God. We study the Bible because it is the Word of God. So many people talk about the relative lack of biblical literacy, and by the way, that is 100% true. The relative lack of biblical literacy today as opposed to 50 to 100 years ago, both in culture and frankly within some of our churches. But we need to be careful that we don't turn it into, people need to know what's in this book. Okay, well, why? Is it part of the citizenship test or something? Well, no, because it's the Word of God.
Right.
It's a citizenship test for the kingdom of God, is to know these principles and to live them. See? And so, we need to make sure those principles are at the forefront and constantly be reminding ourselves not to be distracted by popularity, by power. We've talked about how people wanted access to power, and what's necessary to access power is sometimes you have to make compromises. And any study of political history will tell you that. Sometimes those compromises are necessary, but sometimes those compromises are things that shouldn't be compromised. Those are principles that, it might mean I can't support that. And if it costs me power, it costs me power because Political power is not the power that God has. The other thing we need to keep before us is the true nature of the church. And this goes to in Romans, the passages in Romans that you were talking about, Romans 9 and Romans 11. It's right there in the middle of Romans, but it's the part we always skip over because it's hard.
Not as many fun verses to quote.
Yeah, there's not any fun verses to take out of context, or to really sink your teeth into. It's what it is, though. It's a lot of stuff about Israel.
Yep.
And what's interesting is Paul, in a couple of places, we'll go to Romans 9 here real quick, assuming I can find it. In Romans 9, let's see here. Okay. I'll start, where am I?
19.
Okay. Yeah, start in verse 19. You will say to me then, why does he still find faults? Okay, so for who can resist his will? Okay, so why does God find fault with people who, with the immediate reference here is Esau? God chose Jacob, not Esau. Okay, but who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honored use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? Even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people I call my people, and her who was not beloved I will call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. Okay, so he's literally quoting a prophetic passage that uses the term remnant in it. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about how God is saying, look, I'll call people out of the Gentiles if I want. It's my kingdom. Okay. Paul here is equating the church. He does it again at the beginning of chapter 11. He is equating the church with the prophetic remnant. The idea of the remnant is just all through the prophets. And by the way, you want a lesson in what God means when he talks about justice, go read the prophets. Okay. It is shot through the prophets. And one of the things you see, because the prophets are warning the people, you have left God. You have left God. And by the way, there are some passages where the people say, we haven't left God. We're still going to the temple. Where is the reference here? Jeremiah 7. It references the temple of the Lord. And the idea there is the people were saying, but we have the temple of the Lord. And Jeremiah is saying, so what? You got the temple, but you don't have the heart of God. Okay. And so the prophetic remnant that is talked about, the group of people that God will call out of Israel, unfaithful Israel, Israel that drifts away constantly, and God says, okay, I still have these people, and I'm going to call my people out. Well, that's the church. And that's one of the most important things to remember is we are, as the church, I'll hear people use Old Testament passages a lot, and I'll think, okay, hold on a minute. Be careful with that. Jeremiah, what's the graduation verse? The citation?
29.
Yeah.
I know the plans I have for you.
For I know the plans I have for you. If you go read what comes next, he says, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and all that. And that sounds great until you read the rest of the passage. And he says, but you couldn't be bothered to do what I asked you to do. And so I'm not going to prosper you. Okay.
What a downer graduation.
Right. It really is. It really is. Now, implicit in that is God will prosper us if we follow his plans. And see, that's the thing is we get tied up in this earth. we need to remember, as the song says, this world is not my home. That is the core, is this world is not our home. And this church that we belong to, the church doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. It belongs to God. And it's his power. It's his faithfulness. That is the rock of our foundation. And if we can keep our focus on that, you mentioned you don't have to be rich to be materialistic. Sometimes I think people who are not quite rich, and of course, where do you draw the line on what is not quite rich? Well, as the rich man said, a little bit more. Okay. We are so incredibly comfortable in our nation, and we should thank God for that. I'm not saying we should ask God to take that away from us. But we are so incredibly comfortable that we keep thinking, well, if I could just get a little bit more, then I'd be really comfortable. That's not our comfort. Our comfort is from God.
Yeah. We are at the 30-minute mark. We're going to revisit these concepts over the next few weeks. So there's more questions that I'm sure both of us have percolating. What's a takeaway from this opening idea? What do people need to know as we are thinking about how I can be I can prepare myself to remain with God?
None of this is easy, and it's not popular, and it's going to cost. We think of when we come to passages like where Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me." Because the cross is so prevalent in our culture, and it's been kind of sanitized, if you will. People wear it on a necklace, they wear it as jewelry. We see, it's stylized representations are in a lot of our churches. I mean, some of the handles of some of our communion trays have crosses on them. I mean, and that kind of takes away what Jesus is saying there, which is, no, take up your method of humiliating, excruciating. That's literally where the word excruciating comes from, is crucifixion. Humiliating, excruciating, worst form of punishment. In the ancient Roman Empire, if you were a Roman citizen, you were not allowed to be crucified because it was considered too demeaning for a Roman citizen to be killed in that way. Okay? Take up that and follow me. When the people heard that, when the first century Jews heard, take up your cross and follow me, they went, whoa, time out here. No, it's not going to be easy. And we need to stop pretending that it will be. And it won't have an earthly reward. But Romans 8, of course, the passage Romans 8:28, for all things work together to the good of those who are called according to his purpose. That doesn't promise that everything's going to be just hunky-dory and that everything will work out beautifully while we're on this earth. What it does promise is, if we are faithful unto death, and that doesn't necessarily mean martyrdom, if we are faithful unto our death, then we will have the ultimate good, which is to be with God.
I will echo some of the things that you have said, and just a little bit different on the wording. If your faith, if being a Christian is not difficult, then chances are you're doing it wrong. We should not seek to be happy in our faith, but to seek after that which is meaningful, that which has true purpose to it, which, as we as Christians know, can only be found in God. He's the only eternal purpose, or the only giver of eternal purpose that there is. And so we shouldn't be surprised when our brothers and sisters who were supposed to be carrying each other's burdens, we shouldn't be surprised when we see that I'm finding it hard, and I need the help of a brother or sister to bring me along. We should talk about these things, and to go back to passing this on to our children. There's a reason that throughout the Pentateuch, specifically in Deuteronomy, it says have these conversations all the time. Continue to talk about it. It's a way of living, and is not something that will just be done just because you thought it would be done. So it's a higher calling for us. We've left a lot uncovered this week, and Luckily, we have a few more weeks to try our best to wrestle with some of these ideas. So hopefully this has been a good introduction, and I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us for this Sunday morning Bible class, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.